The night sky above Moscow was supposed to be calm, like any other summer night, but instead it pulsed with a strange, ominous hum. People first mistook it for distant thunder or the rumbling of planes from Sheremetyevo Airport. But when the sudden wail of air raid sirens cut through the silence, hearts froze. Few in the capital had ever truly believed the war raging hundreds of kilometers away could reach this far, into the glass and steel of Moscow's business heart, the $1.2 billion towers that symbolized wealth, ambition, and pride. At 2:37 a.m., the first drone struck. A blinding explosion lit up the facades of the skyscrapers, shattering windows and raining shards of glass onto the streets below. The ground shook as if the city itself recoiled from the violence. A second drone followed, this one slamming into a different tower, sparking fires that climbed up like orange vines against the midnight sky. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the lights flickered, alarms screamed, and the once invincible Moscow city towers stood like wounded giants. Inside the towers, chaos erupted. Office workers who had been burning the midnight oil ran for stairwells, stumbling over each other as smoke filled the hallways. Security guards shouted instructions that were swallowed by the roar of fire alarms. Families living in luxury apartments on the upper floors scrambled to gather children, clutching them to their chests as they tried to navigate the choking smoke. Phones buzzed with frantic messages. "Are you safe? Get out now, where are you?" On the streets below, the scene was no less terrifying. Cars screeched to a halt, their drivers leaping out in panic as flaming debris crashed onto the pavement. Pedestrians scattered like birds, some falling to the ground from the force of the blast. The sharp scent of burning metal and plastic filled the air. A woman in a red coat screamed as she realized her husband was trapped inside one of the damaged towers. She tried to run toward the entrance, only to be pulled back by strangers who knew the building could collapse at any moment. The authorities were quick to respond. Fire trucks roared through the city, their sirens merging with the chaos already underway. Paramedics rushed forward, braving falling glass to reach the injured. Police officers established barricades to keep civilians away, though many resisted, desperate to know if their loved ones were alive inside. Through all the noise and terror, a strange quiet settled in certain corners of the street. Strangers huddled together, comforting one another though they had never met before. A man gave his jacket to a bleeding teenager, pressing it against her arm to stop the flow of blood. An elderly woman was guided to safety by a group of young men who linked arms around her like a shield. Above them all, the towers burned like torches in the night, their glass facades reflecting the chaos below. No one knew whether more drones were coming, or if this was just the beginning. But in that moment, beneath the smoke and flames, the people of Moscow were not thinking of politics or war. They were thinking of survival, of family, of life. And though fear was everywhere, so too was something unexpected. The very first sparks of kindness, glimmering in the darkness like small lights refusing to go out. Firefighters battled the blazes with streams of water that hissed into the night, but it was clear the inferno was not going to be tamed quickly. The flames licked higher, eating through glass and steel as if they were paper. Smoke rolled through the skyline, blackening the stars above Moscow. The towers that once gleamed like monuments of wealth now looked like tombstones, glowing red from within. Yet, on the ground, where chaos could have turned into despair, something unexpected began to take shape. Strangers who had been running for their own lives stopped to help others. There was no order, no official command, just human instinct refusing to abandon those in need. Near the base of one tower, a young man named Sergei found a child crying beside an overturned stroller. The boy's mother lay unconscious a few feet away, struck by falling glass. Sergei could have run. The building groaned ominously above, debris still raining down, but instead he lifted the woman in his arms and called for help. Another passerby, a delivery worker still in his reflective jacket, rushed to take the child. Together they carried both mother and son toward the paramedics, shouting for a clear path. Across the street, an elderly man was trapped beneath a collapsed metal awning. 2 university students tried to lift it, but their strength wasn't enough. A businessman in a tailored suit, his expensive shoes ruined by ash and water, saw their struggle and wordlessly joined in. The 3 of them grunted, sweat and soot streaking their faces, until finally the awning gave way and the old man was pulled free. He clutched their hands, whispering a shaky, "Spasibo," through cracked lips. The acts of bravery multiplied like sparks catching fire. A taxi driver abandoned his car in the middle of the road, using it instead to ferry the wounded back and forth to a temporary medical station set up by paramedics. 2 young women tore their scarves into strips to make bandages. A retired nurse, living nearby, came down with her old first aid kit, treating burns and cuts right there on the sidewalk. Even the firefighters, hardened by years of emergencies, noticed something different. One of them later recalled how civilians stood shoulder to shoulder with them, forming a chain to pass bottled water, blankets, and supplies. It wasn't soldiers or police that kept order, he said, it was the people themselves. They refused to give in to panic. And in the middle of this, stories of remarkable courage unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. A teenage boy guided a blind man out of a smoke-filled subway entrance nearby, never leaving his side until he was safe. A grocery store owner opened his shop to hand out water and bread, refusing payment. An exhausted paramedic, collapsing from smoke inhalation, was helped back to her feet by the very civilians she was trying to save. The night air was thick with fear, yet threaded through it was a stronger current, kindness. Every gesture, every hand that reached out, seemed to defy the destruction above. It was as if the city had been stripped of its wealth, its steel, its glass, and in that stripping away, what remained was something raw and human, something that no drone strike could shatter. For many who lived through that night, the memory would not be of the explosions or the flames, but of the way strangers became allies, neighbors, even family. The fire might have consumed glass and stone, but kindness kept consuming fear, pushing it back with quiet, stubborn strength. In the chaos of fire and broken glass, one of the strangest encounters of the night unfolded. Inside the damaged lower floors of Tower 4, a group of people had been trapped by falling debris. Smoke coiled through the stairwells, and the heat was rising fast. Among them was a Ukrainian construction worker named Dmytro, who had been in Moscow for months, doing renovation work on one of the office suites. He was one of thousands of migrant workers who kept the city's towers gleaming, though few people ever noticed them. When the first explosion shook the tower, Dmytro had been fixing a ceiling panel. He dove under a desk as glass rained down. The second blast sealed the main exit with rubble. Around him, people screamed, businessmen in crisp shirts, cleaners in uniforms, a teenage girl visiting her father at work. They were trapped together, coughing in the smoke. For a moment, no one moved. Fear froze them like statues. Then Dmytro stood. His thick accent gave him away instantly, and a businessman snapped, "You're Ukrainian, aren't you? This is your people's fault." The words cut like a blade. Dmytro felt his throat tighten. Part of him wanted to lash back, to defend himself, to shout that he hadn't chosen this war. But then he saw the teenage girl clutching her father's arm, her face streaked with tears. She was no soldier, no enemy. Just a child. The anger slipped from him like water. He looked at the rubble blocking the exit, the fire edging closer, and knew that survival mattered more than blame. "Help me," he said simply, ignoring the insult. He pressed his shoulder against a slab of fallen plaster. At first, no one moved. But then the girl's father joined him. Then the cleaner. Slowly, grudgingly, even the angry businessman added his strength. Together they shoved until a narrow gap opened. Smoke poured through, but beyond it, a stairwell was still clear. Dmytro didn't wait for thanks. He grabbed the girl's hand, guiding her low under the smoke, urging her father to follow. The group stumbled downward, coughing, eyes streaming. When they reached the ground floor, part of the lobby had collapsed. Fire crackled through the ceiling. The only path forward was a half-blocked service tunnel. "Too small," the businessman muttered. "We'll never fit." But Dmytro dropped to his knees, crawling through first. He pushed debris aside with his bare hands until his knuckles bled. Behind him, the others hesitated, but then the girl crawled after him. "Come," she called to her father, her voice trembling but determined. One by one, they followed. At the tunnel's end, Dmytro emerged into the cool night air, coughing, his face black with soot. He turned, pulling the girl out, then her father, then the others. When the last person crawled free, the tunnel collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. The group staggered to safety, paramedics rushing toward them. The girl threw her arms around Dmytro, sobbing into his chest. Her father, still shaken, placed a hand on his shoulder. Even the businessman who had cursed him stood silent, shame and gratitude roaring in his eyes. Later, as dawn broke and the fires were finally brought under control, that group would tell reporters about the Ukrainian worker who saved their lives. Some would remember his bleeding hands, others the calm way he guided them through the smoke. But all of them agreed on one thing. In that moment, he wasn't Ukrainian or Russian, enemy or outsider. He was simply human, and his kindness had carved a path through fire where none seemed possible. Morning light crept over the Moscow skyline, dimmed by smoke and the skeletons of wounded towers. Firefighters were still dousing the last embers, their hoses spraying arcs of water that glittered in the dawn. The streets, once filled with fear, now held a different kind of silence, the heavy, exhausted hush that follows catastrophe. Ambulances idled, their back doors open as paramedics tended to the last of the injured. Families clung to one another. Some wept. Some simply stared at the blackened glass high above, unable to comprehend what had happened. And yet, amid the ruins, kindness continued to flow like an underground river breaking through the cracks. Volunteers had already begun arriving with blankets, bottles of water, and hot tea. A small group of university students set up a table to collect donations for the families who had lost their homes in the luxury apartments. Old women from nearby neighborhoods shuffled in carrying baskets of food, insisting that even strangers needed a hot meal after such a night. What had begun as survival had now shifted into something gentler, solidarity. The people who had carried each other through fire were now carrying each other through grief. On a bench near the square, Dmytro sat with bandaged hands, watching quietly as people moved around him. His clothes were still scorched, his face smudged with soot. The girl he had saved earlier ran up to him, holding a paper cup of tea. "Papa says you should drink," she said softly. Her eyes were still red from tears, but her smile was steady. He accepted the tea, his rough fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, little one." Her father approached too, offering not just gratitude but something heavier, more difficult. "I was wrong," he admitted, voice low. "I judged you because of where you are from. But last night, without you, my daughter would not be alive. Without you, none of us would." He paused, swallowing. "You are family now, no matter the flags flying above us." The words sank deep. Dmytro looked at him, then at the cluster of strangers nearby, the cleaner, the students, even the businessman who had insulted him. They were all watching with quiet respect. For a moment, the walls built by war seemed to crumble, leaving only the raw truth of human connection. Across the plaza, another scene unfolded. The taxi driver who had ferried the wounded was now using his car to reunite people with relatives who couldn't reach the site on their own. He refused any payment, waving away rubles with a tired smile. Later, he said, "When the city heals." A retired nurse was still working tirelessly, wrapping fresh bandages on those overlooked in the first wave of care. Her wrinkled hands shook from fatigue, but when someone offered her a seat, she shook her head. "I will rest when they rest." Journalists moved through the crowd, searching for stories of destruction, but what they found instead were stories of kindness. Neighbors who had never spoken before now shared bread and grief. A man whose apartment had been destroyed was offered a spare room by another family he had met only hours earlier. Children who had been strangers the day before now clung to each other like siblings, playing quietly with toys salvaged from the rubble. By midday, the government announced that Moscow City would be rebuilt, that the towers would rise again. But for the people who had lived through the night, the real rebuilding had already begun. It was not in steel or glass, but in trust, compassion, and a recognition that even in war's shadow, humanity could shine brighter than fire. As Dmytro finally rose to leave, the girl slipped her hand into his. She refused to let go until her father gently placed her arm around his shoulders instead. The three of them walked together toward the metro, the crowd parting for them like a quiet guard of honor. And though the skyline above bore scars that would last for years, those who had been there would remember something else. The way kindness had risen from the ashes, stronger than glass, stronger than towers, stronger even than war itself.